Hey Mike, so I'm going through the hydraulic schematic for line 2 in regards to the rapid cycling of the hydraulic power unit. So components, we got our pump, high pressure filter, we have a unloading valve, pilot operated, and two pressure adjustment valves for roll 3 and roll 1. And then we have our accumulator circuit. So the pump kicks on, sends a displacement into the system, goes through our high pressure filter. First connection point sends our displacement off to our unloading valve. In its normal state, it's closed, so our displacement continues to our second tie-in point, which is a sense line. We'll come back to this, but very important. Our displacement continues to our third tie-in point and feeds our pressure adjusting valves for roll 3 and roll 1, as well as supplying our accumulator circuit. So once this displacement of the pump starts to see a resistance and builds the pressure of our settings of 310, this sense line is picking up that sense in that pressure line and bringing it in to our unloading valve and allowing now this pressure port to tie in with a return or tank port. They're sending our displacement to a return filter and then right back to tank. This is our system return coming in as well. So you have two returns coming into tank. Any bypass in the system, as we're seeing with the rapid cycling rate, is going to cause this sense line to read that pressure drop or that bypass in the system. Once it goes below the threshold of 280, this sense line is going to be overcome by that spring rated pressure, and it's going to allow that spool to shift back to its closed position. When that happens, our displacement is now then sent back into the system to repressurize our roll valves and our accumulator. Once we once again achieve that 310, we see it in our sense line, comes over, ties in our pressure supply to our tank. So now the pump is able to, any displacement coming out of the pump now has a direct path right back to the reservoir. So there's no resistance on the system. And that's where the accumulator's coming in. Once we achieve that, our pump goes into a free state. Our accumulator supply now, you got nitrogen on top of hydraulics. So that nitrogen pressure is keeping that force on the supply for roll 3 and roll 1. Once again, any bypass in the system is going to allow this spring rated pressure to overcome the system pressure and allowing that spool to go back to its closed position, and once again repeating the recharge of the system. So that's where the rapid cycling rate is coming in. Now that I got the valves from 1 and 3 and the unloading valve here at the shop for inspection, didn't find anything wrong with our pressure valves for our rolls. When we come to the unloading valve, so on the print, this block here represents the port block, which is this. This is your port block where our fittings go into. This block here represents our manifold block, which we have a 2-piece manifold block here. And this guy is our control spool, which is this arrow. So once we achieve our 310 bar on our sense line, that sense is coming through our B port on our port block, and then through our manifold block, which this is our B port. So this is our sense coming in. This is the manifold block. This is our B port coming out into our B port of the manifold block. So when that oil comes into that B port, it sends it into this bottom port here, which sends it into this bottom port. And then see this orifice right here? That puts a pressure on the backside of our spool, control spool of the unloading valve, or the arrow in the diagram. So once we see that sense pressure on the B port coming in, going through our port block, through our manifold block, coming through this bottom port, and once this is all bolted together, it's putting a pressure on that spool and holding it to a position to where P could be connected to T and rely on the accumulator to supply the system pressure. The thing is when I took this apart, there were no sealing rings on the cavities to isolate the ports from one another. So I've got the sealing rings in stock, no biggie. But each port should have a sealing ring to isolate the manifold block and the port block ports from one another. Without those sealing rings, while we were seeing our sense coming in on our B port, coming out into the manifold block, there's no sealing ring on that B port to isolate it from the other ports. So we were seeing massive bypass on this mating block from the port block to the manifold block. So we're going to clean all this up, reseal everything, go back together, and I'll be out tomorrow and we'll get this thing going for you, buddy.